right, so I like to begin this lecture with a quote from Bertrand Russell. I'll end the lecture with a quote from Bertrand Russell. And I don't think we're actually reading Russell this class, but we'll certainly be referring to him. And Russell's a very important and influential philosopher of the 20th century. He was the first philosopher to win a Nobel Prize. There is no Nobel Prize for philosophy, but there is for literature, and this guy wrote a lot about a great many subjects, and he wrote very, very well. And Russell wrote on, like I said, many subjects, one of them on philosophy of science and on some of the issues that we're going to be dealing with in this class. But one of the issues that we're concerned with now is, well, what is philosophy? And he says something really, really good in relation to that question. He says, philosophy, as I shall understand the word, is something intermediate between theology and science. Like theology, it consists of speculations on matters as to which definite knowledge has so far been unascertainable. But like science, it appeals to human reason rather than to authority, whether that of tradition or that of revelation. All definite knowledge, so I should contend, belongs to science. All dogma as to what surpasses definite knowledge belongs to theology. But between theology and science, there is a no man's land exposed to attack from both sides. This no man's land is philosophy. Now, I like this quote because he explicitly states that philosophy ain't science, okay? And it isn't. And we're taking a class in the philosophy of science, so it's important for you to understand what philosophy is as well as what science is, because if you're doing science, you're not doing philosophy. That's not to say that you can't be philosophical or be concerned with the kinds of questions philosophers deal with when you're doing science. But there is a difference between science and theology. And the reason why he's talking about theology here is it's sort of reasonable. If you go to a philosophy section at some commercial bookstore and you go look on the shelves, you're going to find lots of books on spiritualism and mysticism and all this stuff that you're not going to encounter in any philosophy course at a university. So lots of people think that somehow you can't do philosophy without dealing with questions about the nature of God or religion and so on, and that's just not true. So I like the fact that Russell sets up philosophy as something other than religion or theology as well as other than science. And it's this no man's land exposed to attack from both sides. I like that. So the question for us here, the larger question, is what is philosophy? And have you ever heard the word before? Of course you have, particularly since I've got so many majors in the class. The problem is, well, what does philosophy mean? And, well, one way of attacking the meaning of the question, what is philosophy, that is the word, is through the connotation of philosophy. And connotation is one of the things that sort of corresponds to the dictionary definition of the word. Or it could just be a sense of the word. Well, there is this sense of the word philosophy to mean a worldview, that what philosophy is a worldview. The problem with that here in this context is that it doesn't do anything at all to illuminate what you're going to be studying in this class. Not the least of which is that everyone has a worldview. So if all philosophy is a worldview, then it utterly trivializes what philosophy is as a field, and that's not good either. So I don't think the connotation of a worldview helps us very much, even though we can accurately and correctly use that connotation outside of class, but in a class like this, it doesn't really help us understand what we're going to be doing. What about the etymology of the word philosophy? Well, it comes from the Greek group phila and sophia, which means a lover of wisdom. And the first person to call himself a philosophos, a lover of wisdom, was Pythagoras, by the way, of the Pythagorean theorem fame. But the idea here is this. Does the etymology of the word philosophy help you understand what you're going to be studying this semester? I ask you rhetorically, and the answer should be no. At the very least, it presupposes that you know what wisdom is. There's no question that philosophers value wisdom or knowledge, right? But we don't want to imply that only people who are wise can do philosophy. In any event, I don't think the etymology is terribly useful. What about the definition of philosophy? Well, this is a pretty standard kind of definition that we'd find if we were to look up the word philosophy in a dictionary. And notice that there are a number of different connotations or senses here, 10 of them. The first one has a couple of different versions of it. 1, love and pursuit of wisdom by intellectual means and moral self-discipline as a definition for philosophy. Well, that marries up quite nicely with the etymology, but this moral self-discipline bit suggests that somehow you can't do philosophy unless you're a saint. And although some philosophers were saints, and even though Socrates wasn't a saint in the sort of Catholic sense, if there was anyone that was a moral philosopher, it was that guy. I mean, trying to live the right life, the good life, doing what you ought to do. But I don't think, again, this really helps you understand what we're going to be doing in this class. What about B? The investigation of causes and laws underlying reality as a definition for philosophy. Does that strike you as a definition for anything else?
Science.
Any particular science or just science in general?
Physics.
Russell, begins the lecture here by saying, well, philosophy isn't a science. It's not a theology. It's somewhere in between. But the investigation of causes and laws underlying reality certainly makes it sound like a science, not just any science, in particular physics. So I don't think that's terribly helpful, but particularly in the context of trying to understand what philosophy of science is. Now we're confused. Are we going to be doing science or not? What about C? A system of philosophical inquiry or demonstration. Does that help you understand what philosophy is? Yes or no? Why? It's a crappy definition. You can't understand what philosophy is unless you already understand what philosophy is. What about number 2? Inquiry into the nature of things based on logical reasoning rather than empirical methods. Now this is useful for us because, again, philosophy isn't science. Scientists rely on empirical methods. That is, methods requiring the collection of data or the recording of observations. And it's not to say that philosophers don't rely on empirical data as a part of their arguments, but you can never settle a philosophical question by performing an experiment or merely collecting data or recording observations. Because if you're doing that, then it's an empirical question. It's not a philosophical one. So I like the fact that it says based on logical reasoning rather than empirical methods. Reasoning, as you'll see, crucially matters to doing philosophy. You can't do philosophy unless you're reasoning. But what about, contrast number 2 with number 7. The science comprising logic, ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, and epistemology. Well, is it a science or isn't it? Right? So this empirical methods is what you use in science, but in number 7 it says the science comprising logic, ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, and epistemology. Now, in a few minutes you're going to hear what logic is, ethics is, metaphysics, epistemology, and so on. So if you don't know those words right now, well, that's fine. You will hear in a second. And after today, you're going to be held responsible for what those words mean and the variations of those words. But to define philosophy as a science is to completely mischaracterize what philosophy is. What about number 4, the synthesis of all learning? Does that help you understand what you're going to be doing? No, there's a sense in which, well, that's true. I mean, in the beginning, there was religion. When folks started giving non-religious answers to certain fundamental questions, we had, it turns out, the simultaneous emergence of both philosophy and science. And if you were to take a physics class, typically the first chapter is devoted to guys like Thales and Anaximenes and Anaximander and so on, these Ionian cosmologists, these pre-Socratic philosophers who were concerned with the ultimate nature of reality, existence, that is, what the universe is made out of. And they were giving non-religious answers to those questions. So we tend to, in philosophy, consider them to be the first philosophers, and the scientists tend to consider those guys to be, well, the first scientists. The point is, they were not doing religion, but they also weren't doing philosophy as we consider the word philosophy. The point is, I don't think the definition of philosophy is terribly helpful in having you understand what we're going to be studying, much less what you're going to be doing, particularly since we're doing philosophy of science, and we're told here that it both is and isn't a science. And Russell says at the beginning that it's not a science. It's not theology, it's something else. So rather than take a look at the dictionary definition, what I like to do is to draw an analogy, actually, to a science. A soft science, as it were, but a science nevertheless. And I suspect that, in fact, let me ask you, have any of you taken a psychology class before? Most of you. In fact, that's good. And it turns out this is a 3,000 level class in philosophy, and the one guy last class who said he had never taken a philosophy class, well, he's decided not to take it because this is a bit intimidating if you've never taken a philosophy class. The point is that you have some sense of what psychology is, and you know that psychology is the scientific field that studies mental processes and behavior. And obviously someone who does psychology is a psychologist. Well, because you can study mental processes and behavior by employing a variety of different methods and techniques and certain assumptions, we have different subfields of psychology. So we've got behavioral psychology and clinical psychology, cognitive psychology, Freudian psychology, neuropsychology, and so on. And we break up the field of psychology in accordance to the various kinds of questions and methods the folks use in psychology to answer the questions that drive their research. Similarly, philosophy can be broken up into its subfields, but philosophy ain't a science, it's in the humanities, right? So I would never ask you to regurgitate this definition for philosophy, but it's not a scientific field, it's a humanistic field, it's part of the humanities. That attempts to resolve, and this is going to matter, so we're going to spend a chunk of time talking about fundamental questions. Your first one, when an argument question has to do with fundamental questions. But philosophy is the humanistic field that attempts to resolve fundamental questions through reason. And obviously someone who does philosophy is called a philosopher. Well, just as we can break psychology up into its subfields based on the questions and the methods and so on that folks in psychology use or employ in order to do psychology, well, we can break philosophy up into its subfields based on the kinds of questions and methods folks use in philosophy in order to do philosophy. And these subfields include the list of items that you see here: aesthetics, epistemology, ethics, history of philosophy, logic, metaphysics, philosophy of language, philosophy of mind, yada, 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 philosophy of science, and so on. All right. Now, in due course, you're going to see a number of specific questions that folks in these subfields attempt to answer, which is how we're able to divide philosophy into these various subfields. But the point is, I don't think you get to understand what philosophy is by taking a look at definitions. Rather, you need to take a look at what philosophers do in order to do philosophy. And according to me, there are two requirements for doing philosophy. The first is that you need to be attempting to resolve the right set of questions. And I am intentionally vague when I put it that way. The point is that not just any old question counts as a philosophical question. So in general, these questions of the right sort are what I tend to reduce to simply as fundamental questions. These are fundamental questions. They're open questions. They're questions about the meaning, truth, or logical relations among our ideas, our concepts, our beliefs, our assumptions, our explanations, and so on, right? That's what fundamental questions are. And you can't do philosophy unless you're dealing with one of those. Now, the particular fundamental questions that philosophers attempt to resolve will help us define all of the various subfields of philosophy. And you're going to see a number of them. But since fundamental questions are so important to the practice of actually doing philosophy, I want to pause here for a second and talk about fundamental questions. And they have certain features. One of them is that fundamental questions arise in every sphere of learning. Now, I suspect almost all of you know this. What does PhD mean? It means Doctor of Philosophy. Did you all know that prior to coming into class today? Be honest, did you know that? All right, so I have a PhD. Everyone in my department has a PhD. Does that mean everyone that has a Doctor of Philosophy, that is the title, that rates being called doctor because they have a PhD, does that mean everyone that has a PhD has a doctorate in philosophy? And the answer is no. You can get a doctorate of philosophy in English or chemistry or Swahili or whatever. That is, when you deal with the highest level or the kinds of highest level questions in your field and you attempt to resolve them, well, historically, we call these people doctors of philosophy, even if they're not in the field of philosophy. I mean, philosophy is the queen of the humanities. I mean, it existed first, and all of these other sciences have emerged, all these other fields have emerged from philosophy in the course of, intellectual maturity and whatnot. So there's a reason why we call the highest degree that you can get at a university a Doctor of Philosophy, because we began it, right? But the point is, you can get a PhD in anything. So it's not the case that the only people who deal with fundamental questions are folks like me in academic departments of philosophy. That's my point here. Another feature of fundamental questions is they generally involve logical questions of principle. That is, questions regarding claims about what must or what must not be the case among certain ideas given their logical relations. And I'm emphasizing the word logical and whatnot here because it's really, really important. And even if you haven't had a class on logic, and ultimately all philosophy majors have to have at least one class on logic, the reason why logic matters so much is that logic is concerned with the principles and methods of good reasoning. So you study logic in order to discover what you ought to do if you want to reason well, what you ought not to do if you want to avoid reasoning badly. And because I can't presuppose that any of you have actually had logic, the next couple of weeks, week and a half or so, we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about some fundamental issues that we deal with in logic, about the nature of statements and the logical relations between them, what an argument is, how to recognize it, a couple things about how to evaluate it, because logical reasoning matters. And it turns out, as you'll see here in a second, the second conditions about doing philosophy has to do with reasoning, and you can't reason without arguing. But the point here is that very often philosophers are concerned with questions where we're drawing out the logical relations between or among our ideas, or questions about what must or what must not be the case. So the issue, as an example that I give you here, is, well, what makes a person a person? When I ask that question, I'm not asking what the definition of a person is. I'm asking what conditions must be met in order for something to be a person. And you're not going to settle that by opening up a dictionary, right? You're going to settle it by defending a certain set of conditions that you think are necessary and together sufficient in order for something to be a person. The point is, there are lots and lots and lots of questions like this, and you're going to see a number of them related to this class. So this is one feature of fundamental questions. Another is that, and this is an important one, fundamental questions cannot be answered or resolved by appealing to empirical facts. And this is another way in which the word empirical is cropped up here in the lecture today. And by empirical facts, I mean truths about the world that can be confirmed, verified, or falsified by observation. And here's the point. You can't settle a fundamental question by collecting data or by conducting an experiment. Ever. It's not that the data or the observations are irrelevant to resolving or determining what's most reasonable to believe about any particular fundamental question. It's just that you can never settle the issue by that alone. If you can settle an issue by collecting data or performing an experiment, then it's an empirical issue, not a philosophical one. Consider the difference here. What's the definition of pseudoscience? That is, what's the definition of the word pseudoscience? Well, that's an empirical question. Why? Because I can settle that by opening up a dictionary and taking a look at what the definition of pseudoscience is. If I were to ask what's the nature of a pseudoscience, I'm asking a different kind of question. For the what is the nature of pseudoscience, I'm asking what turns out a metaphysical question. What conditions must be met in order for something to be a pseudoscience? What distinguishes a pseudoscience from a genuine science? Here, reasoning is required to resolve this. Simply opening up a dictionary and taking a look at the definition will settle the other issue. Lots and lots of examples of this. So I want you to be thinking about fundamental questions beginning today and then over the course of the semester, because you're going to start recognizing philosophical issues in contexts where you might not have recognized them before. And part of the reason you can do that is that fundamental questions are not limited to what folks like me in academic departments of philosophy deal with, that they're ubiquitous, like McDonald's. I mean, they're everywhere. Another feature of fundamental questions is that they arise when there's a conflict between competing ideas, each of which can be supported by the evidence. And this is an important feature of fundamental questions. That is, there's hardly ever in philosophy one correct and every other, well, there's one correct answer and every other answer is wrong. Rather, it's that good reasons can be given for this position and good reasons can be given for this position, and a big part of a philosopher's job is to determine which of those two positions is more reasonable to believe. And very often, these positions are going to be incompatible. They can't all be true. They'll be inconsistent or mutually exclusive. And resolving these fundamental questions requires, like I just said, determining what's most reasonable to believe, and you can't determine what's most reasonable to believe without the second requirement, which is the use of reason. So the first requirement is that you're dealing with the right sort of question. That is a fundamental question. And the second requirement for doing philosophy is that you have to be using reason in the attempt to resolve it. Reason, not faith, not revelation, not force. That is, you're not doing philosophy if you're beating somebody over the head. Rather, it requires the use of reason. And above all kinds of critical thinking questions qualify as reasoning. And it's very, very important for you in the context of a philosophy class to be thinking critically. I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of philosophy is critical thinking. And one of the best things you can do in any context when you're thinking critically is to ask relevant and interesting questions. And above all, what do you mean by that? You're using this word, well, what do you mean by that? Making sure that you're actually communicating with somebody, because if you're using the word one way and they're using the word another way, then you may have the appearance of communication, but you're talking past one another. You're not going to be able to resolve the issue. What conditions must be met in order for something to be a blank, whatever it is, to be a genuine science? What conditions must be met in order for something to be a genuine science? What conditions must be met in order for something to be a pseudoscience? What makes a law a law? What makes a scientific theory, and so on? Is blank true? That is, asserting something's one thing, but what conditions must be met in order for it to be true? By asserting blank, aren't you assuming this? What reasons are there for believing that such and such? These are just some examples of common critical thinking questions. And you need to be employing them in this class as well as outside this class, particularly if you're going to be doing philosophy. But the main medium through which we reason in philosophy is going to be through arguments. And an argument isn't a fight. An argument is what we offer in language in order to show that something's true. Every argument in the universe, no matter how complex, consists of exactly two parts. One part is the claim or the conclusion. The other part are the reasons or the evidence offered in order to show that the claim is true. And as arguments go, this isn't a terribly complicated one. And personally, I have really nothing at stake in whether you accept the conclusion here as true. But the thing is, there's a difference between simply making a claim and offering reasons in order to show that your claim is true. For instance, if I wanted to claim that God is not perfect, I could claim it. God's not perfect. You could claim God is perfect. And I could say, no, he's not. You could say, yes, he is. And we're never going to settle the issue that way. In order to settle the issue, I have to give reasons in order to show that my claim is true, just as you do. And anytime you give reasons in order to show that a claim is true, you've offered an argument. This is an argument. And the thing about this particular argument, as you'll discover, is that this argument is expressed in what I call standard form. That is, there's no ambiguity whatsoever what the conclusion of this argument is. Why? Because it's written below the evidence, the premises. It's written below the line separating the premises from the conclusion. And it's written to the right of that little three-dot symbol, which is called the therefore symbol. So when you look at this visually, there's no ambiguity. You know exactly what the claim is that's being made. You also know what reasons are being offered in order to show that the claim is true. And in order for this to be a good argument, collectively, those reasons, when true, ought to guarantee that the conclusion's true. And if that's the case, then you've got a good argument. You're going to be reading arguments in this class. There'll be occasions when we'll be reconstructing arguments in standard form like this and then evaluating arguments. Because the main way in which we reason and employ reasoning in philosophy is going to be through the use of arguments. And that is arguments in order, ultimately, to determine what's most reasonable to believe. Are you with me here? Okay. So, it ain't rocket surgery, but there's some technical stuff that you need to become familiar with that you'll be employing over the course of the semester, which is why I call this section of the class, laying the groundwork so that we can apply that stuff. And if you've had logic before, then you'll have more and more opportunity in order to apply the skills that you've already been exposed to. In any event, I've talked about the two conditions, at least according to me, that must be met in order for someone to do philosophy, and that's dealing with the right sort of question and using reason, not faith, force, whatever, in the attempt to resolve the fundamental question. I've talked a little bit about what fundamental questions are. Now I want to identify some of the specific fundamental questions that a philosophers attempt to resolve, and doing this allows us to identify the core subfields of philosophy. In fact, I'll identify some other fields besides the core one, which includes philosophy of science. So there are a few core subfields of philosophy, and the first of these is called history of philosophy. History of philosophy is the study of the emergence, the examination, and evolution of philosophical ideas as found in the writings of philosophers. Some examples related to what we're going to be doing would be, for instance, what was Popper's solution to the problem of demarcation? Now, of course, you don't really know what the problem of demarcation is, but I'll tell you, according to Popper, the problem of demarcation is where along the line, the continuum between genuine sciences and pure pseudosciences, do we draw the line in order to distinguish genuine science from pseudoscience? He gives us an answer to that question. Some people have serious problems with the answer, or at least how they interpret his answer, and other folks have tried to improve upon it. But you can't answer the question without going into the writings of Popper, or you go to Wikipedia to try to get a Reader's Digest version of it, and that's not what we're going to be doing. So in order to settle the question, we've got to go into the actual writings of the guy. And he doesn't say, here is my solution to the problem of demarcation, although he's almost as explicit as that. That rarely happens. Usually you've got to wade through the text and to infer what their answer or what their solution is based on what they write, and that requires reasoning, right? How prominent was logical positivism in the 20th century? That is a view that we'll talk about over the course of the semester. It was very popular in the first half of the 20th century. Some of the folks we're going to be reading were very prominent logical positivists. So I'm not going to really talk about logical positivism now, but these folks were vehemently opposed to metaphysics. And by that they mean speculative metaphysics. That is the kind of metaphysics you get from folks like Hegel or folks in the German tradition. Folks that committed themselves to the existence of things based on their philosophical system as opposed to evidence from science. I'll just leave it there for now. In any event, they privileged logic. They privileged empiricism. And some of that was very, very good, and a lot of good things happened as a result of it. In what way is Russell, who we saw at the beginning, a realist? Well, by realist we mean one of many things, because you can be a realist about numbers. You can be a realist about, it turns out, a variety of different things. I'll just save that discussion for later. So there are different kinds of realism. This question comes up in the context of realism versus anti-realism, and there's a lot of metaphysical baggage that goes along with this class or this discussion. So we'll get to it. In any event, you can't answer it without reading Russell himself. Another core subfield of philosophy is logic. There's a reason why we require majors to take logic. I mean, I wish everybody were required to take logic. Logic, as I've defined already, is the study of the methods and principles used to distinguish good, that is correct, permissible reasoning, from bad, incorrect, or impermissible reasoning. Logic, like ethics, which you'll see in a second, is a normative discipline. You study ethics in order to discover or learn or apply principles that allow you to evaluate actions into the categories of the morally permissible, the morally impermissible, and the morally obligatory. That is, what you ought to do, what you ought not to do, and what you must do. Similarly, here in logic, you study principles that allow you to learn what you ought to do if you want to reason well, what you ought not to do if you want to avoid reasoning badly, and what you must do if you want to, say, reason cogently or validly. In any event, here are some examples of questions in logic. What is a cogent argument? Does this particular claim follow from that evidence? What makes an assumption dubious? Calling something an assumption is not to call it a bad name. Anymore, as I've said, to call something a theory is to call it a bad name. So you need to know what assumptions are, what role they play in our making assertions, claims, and evidence, and so on. In what ways can the evidence-claim relation break down, resulting in a bad argument? What makes a conceptual analysis successful? Well, you'll learn what a conceptual analysis is, the different kinds of conditions there are, and next week, in fact, you'll be constructing what you think to be a successful conceptual analysis that will be evaluated by other folks. In any event, logic is one of the core areas of philosophy, and that shouldn't surprise you. I mean, it was invented by philosophers, but that's not the reason why it matters so much. Is that you can't do philosophy without reasoning, and logic is, concerned exclusively with principles of good reasoning. Epistemology is one of the core subfields of philosophy, and from now on, I'm holding you responsible for this word and every variation of it. So, epistemic, epistemological, and epistemology is always, without exception, have to do with knowledge. Epistemology, as a subfield of philosophy, is concerned with the nature, origin, and extent of human knowledge. So, what is knowledge? What's the nature of knowledge? Is an epistemological question. Turns out it's also a metaphysical question, and we'll get to that in a second. How do we acquire knowledge? How do you know whether a statement, a law, a theory, or whatever is true? Do you know that the world is as you observe it? That is, how do we know that the world is as it appears to us? These are epistemological questions. Another subfield is metaphysics. And by metaphysics, we don't mean anything spooky or spiritual or supernatural. Rather, metaphysics is typically defined as the study of the ultimate nature of reality or existence. Now, a couple of things I want to note here. One is what the prefix meta means. Meta means one of two things, either after or about. The word metaphysics, I don't think I said this in class the other day, but maybe I did. In any event, I'm going to be redundant. The word metaphysics enters a vocabulary because when folks were compiling Aristotle students' notes about lectures from Aristotle, they compiled all the stuff having to do with sort of natural philosophy, that is physics, stuff about the world, empirical investigations, and so on. They called that the physics. But they had this stuff that didn't quite fit into the physics. So they compiled it, put it after the physics, and it ends up becoming metaphysics, after physics. But what it had to do with questions about the ultimate nature of reality and of existence. And that's typically what we mean by metaphysics. Another use of the word meta as a prefix is about. So metaethics, or a metaethical theory, is a theory about ethical theories. Meta-logic is a theory about other logic. So we're going to be doing some meta-logic in here, some meta-language, meta, whatever. And that's okay. But when we're talking about metaphysics, we're talking about a specific subfield of philosophy. And it doesn't overlap with the science of physics because, well, sciences require empirical methods. You can't do philosophy by relying on empirical methods. So think of it this way. Anytime you ask a question about the existence of something, the nature of something, you're asking a metaphysical question. And there are a variety of ways we can do that. So, for instance, what makes a theory a theory? That is, what conditions must be met in order for something to be a theory? Another version of that question. What is the nature of observation? Do theoretical entities exist? Is a question we're going to be dealing with. What conditions must be met in order for something to be a planet, a pseudoscience, a theory, whatever? And next week you'll learn a method for answering that question. Is anything necessarily true? Is a metaphysical question because necessity is a metaphysical concept. Does the world exist as we perceive it? That is, notice that is a metaphysical question. How do we know that the world is as we perceive it is an epistemological one. And very often, the metaphysical question will be related to the epistemological one and vice versa. The point is, you can't just do metaphysics. That is, you're going to be doing some history of philosophy, you're going to be relying on logic, you're going to be dealing with some epistemology and so on. So it's not that a metaphysical question is only done by people in the field of metaphysics. Everybody in philosophy deals with metaphysical questions and epistemological ones and history of philosophy ones and so on. And we're going to be doing history of philosophy, some logic, some epistemology, as well as some metaphysics. The final core area of philosophy is ethics. And I've already given you a sense that ethics is a bit like logic in that ethics is a normative discipline. Logic is a normative discipline, not exclusively normative, but normative disciplines are concerned about how things ought to be, how things ought not to be, or how things must be. And in logic, we study principles to discover what we ought to do if we want to reason well, what we ought not to do if we want to avoid reasoning badly, what we must do if we want to reason correctly, whatever. Ethics is concerned with the concepts and principles that underlie our evaluations of actions of persons into the categories of the morally permissible, the morally impermissible, the morally obligatory. So when you study ethics, what you ought to do, at least in an introduction to ethics, is survey a variety of different moral theories. Each moral theory will have a specific moral principle that will be the basis for each of you as a moral agent to determine what it is that you ought to do, what you ought not to do, or what you must do. So for instance, what makes a person is both a metaphysical question, because it's dealing with the nature of existence, as well as an ethical one. Why? Because the concept of person is the basic concept in ethics. Is a fetus a person, for instance? It would be metaphysical as well as an ethical question. Should animal testing be permitted? Should researchers get informed consent before conducting studies or experiments on human beings? In my ethics class, we deal with the Milgram experiment explicitly. Maybe we will here in this class. I've got a couple of things that will apply some of the stuff that we're doing. In any event, we're not going to be dealing with ethics so much in this class, but there will be some ethical issues that will crop up. So those are the 5 core areas of philosophy, but this is a class in philosophy of science. So philosophy of science is not one of the core areas. But we can't do philosophy of science without doing history of philosophy, without doing epistemology, without doing metaphysics, without relying on logic. And then there are some ethical issues, so we can say that, well, we can do ethics a bit too. But what philosophy of science is, well, it's not science, it's philosophy of science. So this is going to be the study of the methods, assumptions, and the limits of the practice of science. So for instance, what makes a theory a scientific theory? What kind of question is that? It's a metaphysical question. If you were to say, well, that's a philosophy of science question. Well, yes, it is, but more appropriately, it's a metaphysical question. What distinguishes genuine science from pseudoscience? The next one, do non-observable entities like quarks, for instance, exist? We're going to be dealing with that head on. Why are the soft sciences like sociology and anthropology not as successful as the hard sciences, that is physics, biology, and so on? It's a fundamental question in any event. I hope you're getting a better sense of the kinds of questions we're going to be dealing with, as well as what it is we're going to be doing in this class. There are some other subfields of philosophy, and I'm mentioning philosophy of language because we're going to be doing some of that explicitly as well, in fact, starting next week. So philosophy of language is the philosophical study of language, that is, syntax of language, semantics, meaning, truth, reference, how language is used. That's pragmatic. So what's the nature of language? Metaphysical question. How are thought and language related? What makes a sentence or a word meaningful? What makes a sentence true? Again, metaphysical question. What's the nature of reference? What's the difference between a sentence and a statement? We'll be dealing with some of those questions head on next week, right? Because it's going to matter for us. Because laws, if I were to ask you, well, what's a law? Well, you can't point to one. You can point to the expression of a law through some language, but is the law a sort of thing that can be either true or false? Well, that's going to be an open question, because it turns out if the law is quantitative in nature, then it's essentially a mathematical formula, and formulas don't have truth values any more than questions do. And this may be something you've never really considered before. So we're going to be dealing with some philosophy of language. I'm just telling you. I'm an analytic philosopher, and we deal with language. But there are some other subfields. Actually, speaking of what I do, I'm really a philosopher of mind, but my philosophy degrees, as I told you, got a lot of science in it. So that whole philosophy, neuroscience, psychology thing. So I typically, in fact, this is common for philosophers of mind. I mean, oftentimes, we're dealing with the philosophy of mind question, but that's also simultaneously going to be a philosophy of language issue, and usually a metaphysical or an epistemological one as well, or in the context of philosophy of science. So there's just no pure division is one of the take-home messages. But there's also social political philosophy, which we ain't going to be doing in here. Philosophy of religion, which we ain't going to be doing in here. And aesthetics, which I love, but which we ain't going to be doing in here. So we're going to be doing quite a bit of stuff in this class in philosophy of science, but that's going to include, again, history of philosophy, logic, epistemology, metaphysics, as well as some philosophy of language. We can't do everything, but we're doing quite a bit. All right. Any questions about the subfields? All right. Nearing the end. I want to talk about some certain generalizations and misconceptions about philosophy, as well as some advantages to doing philosophy and what you need to do in order for you to be doing philosophy, and then we'll end for the day. So one of the misconceptions here, again, I've already mentioned this, Doctor of Philosophy is what PhD means, but it doesn't mean you can get a Doctor of Philosophy in just philosophy. You can get a Doctor of Philosophy in anything. So it's not the case that only people that, like me, are ones that are concerned with fundamental questions or doing philosophy. Merely asserting your opinion or your belief does not make you a philosopher. And I shouldn't have to say this, but because fundamental questions there's never really a right answer to them as such. There's a more reasonable answer than others, but there's no factually correct answer to the resolution of a fundamental question. And lots of people tend to say, well, if that's the case, unlike, for instance, was Abraham Lincoln the 16th President of the United States? Either he was or he wasn't. Right? There's no middle ground there. But was Lincoln a good president? Well, that's an open question, right? Good reasons can be given for maybe why he was. Good reasons can be given for maybe why he wasn't. And maybe that's not as contentious as it needs to be in order for you to get the issue. But many people think that because philosophical questions or fundamental questions don't reduce to a one single correct answer, that anything goes, and that any answer is as good as any other. And that's just crap. Because it isn't the case that any one person's opinion is as good as any other's, generally in any other context, but people are tempted to think that in the context of philosophy, which is wrong. But doing philosophy requires more than simply asserting your opinion. At the very least, you have to give reasons for why you think your view is more reasonable than something else. And doing philosophy is largely a matter of determining what's most reasonable to believe. And again, I've already made this point, that it's false that any one person's opinion is as good as any other's. Now, I've been doing philosophy for a long time, but I'm not better at it just because I've been doing it longer. I mean, that's one reason. I mean, I really do know this stuff. Just someone coming into class who've never taken a philosophy class, it would be extremely arrogant of them to think that their opinion was as well informed as my own, say. But But people are often tempted to think that, well, in philosophy, anything goes, and it's just about expressing opinions, and that's not the case. I'm just trying to make that clear to you here at the beginning, that I'll never, ever ask you just for what your opinion is. You're going to have to give me your opinion, that is what you believe, and your reasons for why you believe it. That's going to be an argument. That's going to be interesting, but never just what your opinion is. But this bit about any one person's opinion, I usually use this example, but it's particularly relevant now since you've seen me hobble around. My knee's just been killing me lately. And I've had knee surgery before, and I'm a doctor. But I'm not going to rely on my own opinion about whether I need knee surgery again because my opinion's as good as some orthopedic surgeon. No, you don't believe that in other contexts. Don't buy it here in the context of philosophy. Settling issues and finding truth in philosophy is usually a matter of developing the best reasons for accepting or rejecting a claim. That is the case, as well as, and this is important too, that you have to understand what your predecessor or your opponent is saying before you can criticize it or improve upon it. And this is an important feature as well, that you're going to hear a whole lot of criticism this class. None of it will be directed at the individual, right? It will always be what the individual says. The reason so-and-so gives in defense of their claim, maybe the claim itself, but we're never going to be attacking an individual because philosophy isn't, or ought not to be about attacking individuals. It's about ultimately determining what's most reasonable to believe. But we're not being critical just for the sake of being critical. We're trying to determine what's most reasonable to believe. So we're not just simply tearing stuff down. It's hopefully trying to figure out what's right or what's most reasonable. And there is no other discipline that's devoted to the rigorous, impartial examination of the other guy's or the other gal's point of view. That is, you're going to have to write an essay for me. And one of the things you're going to have to do in your essay is to reconstruct in a fair, accurate, and unbiased way what the view is with which you disagree. You can't reconstruct it and intentionally weaken it in the process. You can't mischaracterize it and then attack the mischaracterized version and think that somehow you've undermined your opponent's actual position. You have to give a fair and accurate reconstruction of this view with which you disagree and then show essentially why you're right and they're wrong. And there's no discipline that's as good at this as philosophy. This isn't ideal, perhaps, but philosophers do not, or perhaps should not, do what they do because they believe that philosophy should compete with or is on par with theology or science. I think most philosophers will buy that. They don't think that, well, philosophy gives you some privileged insight into the reality of things, and the way that religious folk tend to think that their religion gives them privileged access into the reality of things. Philosophers tend not to view it that way, or that doing philosophy somehow is better than science. Now, there have been periods in the history of Western philosophy when philosophers have defended that view, but not so much in the 20th century. There are certain advantages to doing philosophy, and for the record, this is the phi symbol, right? And it's often more elegant to simply write the symbol instead of keeping write philosophy, philosophy, philosophy again. So there are certain advantages to doing philosophy. One of them is that it increases your intellectual independence and tolerance. And that's an advantage. It makes you aware of problematic, ambiguous, and fallacious reasoning by you as well as other people. And that's an advantage. Because you're going to start seeing problems in reasoning in ways that you never did before, the more philosophy classes you take. And this is really, really important. When it compels you to seek reasons for what other people take to be self-evident. I mean, most people go through their lives never questioning why they believe what they believe. I mean, it's sad, but it's true. Why are you a Baptist? Well, my daddy was a Baptist. Why are you a Republican? Well, my daddy was a Republican. I mean, that's a reason. It's just a bad one. And those are rather trivial examples. So you'll discover, and I've already given you that warning on my syllabus, that doing philosophy can be hazardous to your cherished beliefs because you're going to start questioning why you believe things. And this is going to be related to the final quote here that I'll get to in a second. It compels you to think, that is to reason, not just to recite facts. You can't succeed in philosophy by just regurgitating what your professor says in a lecture. Now, granted, there's a descriptively accurate way of answering questions about what I'm saying today, but this is a very uncharacteristic lecture, right? Most of my lectures aren't going to be like this. And it's going to be our exploring what a particular author has to say and our evaluating it, coming up with reasons for accepting it or rejecting it. And that's what philosophy requires. It requires reasoning, not just simply regurgitating the facts back. And in many fields, and I'm not saying disrespectful things about the other fields, but it's not simply about regurgitating what the historical facts are. I mean, it's not about regurgitating dates and places and names and whatnot. There will be some of that on an exam in terms of you're getting what so-and-so's view right? But it's not just simply regurgitation. You've got to actually think and to reason. Now, before you can do philosophy, you have to have the courage to examine your cherished beliefs critically. Now, we're not going to be dealing with lots and lots of sensitive issues in this philosophy of science class, but you ought to be at least willing to have an open mind. You need to be willing to advance tentative claims. And this is important, and I always emphasize this. When we're having a discussion in class, I don't want you to wait in order to come up with the perfect response. That is something that I won't be able to come up with anything critical to say against. Because one, that's not going to happen anyway. And two, while you're thinking about it, you're not participating. And the gap between your thinking about coming up with the perfect response and your lack of participation means that you're not going to get as much out of the discussion if you're trying to come up with the perfect reply, or you're unwilling to offer a tentative claim because you don't want anyone to be critical of it. Well, no one's going to be mean to any of you here about anything that you say, unless you end up being mean to someone, in which case I'll shut that down, right? That'll nip that crap in the bud. And that never really happens in my classes. But the point is, I don't want you to be squeamish about participation in class because, well, I don't have as much philosophy as so-and-so does, and he's going to think I'm stupid or whatever. I mean, you're not here. I mean, first of all, you should never be concerned about the opinions of other people anyway, right? That is, you don't want to be an arrogant little dickhead, in class, and you also don't want to be, the sort of person who just constantly needs to say things in class because they love the sound of their voice. I mean, that's really annoying. We'll shut that down too, but don't be concerned about your expertise in philosophy. You're going to get more out of this class the more you participate. So don't wait to say something because, well, I don't know if that's really right. I'd rather hear something that you put out there that we can discuss. We're going to have a much more enjoyable class that way. So don't be concerned about that. Place truth at the end and not winning the argument. Truth isn't what we can defend against all comers, right? Ultimately, we are doing philosophy, and it's even if we don't know what the right answer is, we can certainly eliminate a lot of bad answers along the way. But it's the truth and wisdom, knowledge that matters, not necessarily winning the argument. I mean, this is philosophy. It's not that as you end up studying some logic, not rhetoric. Rhetoric is persuading people for the sake of persuading them. Logic is about reasoning well. You need to be able to sometimes separate your personality from the content of the discussion. Again, that's probably not going to happen here. We're not dealing with lots of really contentious issues, and it's like, oh man, I'm really committed to this particular theory of pseudoscience, and you're committed to this, and it's not going to engender those kinds of debates, I suspect. It'd be cool if we did, but this is related to something that Russell says, which I rather like. And he says, if an opinion contrary to your own makes you angry, that is a sign that you are subconsciously aware of having no good reason for thinking as you do. So whenever you find yourself getting angry about a difference of opinion, be on your guard. You will probably find on examination that your belief is going beyond what the evidence warrants. That is, when you're arguing with someone and they say something to you and you can't think of what to say back, or they challenge you, well, why do you believe that? And you can't think of any good reasons, you can get frustrated. I think Russell's right. This is usually a sign that you've come to the realization that you really don't have any good reasons for why you believe that. I know this has happened to me in the past. I mean, this is a good thing to happen to you in the course of your philosophical investigations. But the point here is related to the last point that, sometimes trying to determine what's most reasonable to believe requires sort of separating your personality from the content of the discussion. If we were talking about the permissibility of abortion, say, and you had very, very strong views about it, one would hope you would be able to separate your views, your personal beliefs from, or having the intellectual conversation about the nature of persons or the permissibility of this or whatever. In any event, the final thing I want to do is to just give you a reminder here of some of the main questions, fundamental questions, philosophical questions we're going to be considering over the course of the semester. So what's the nature of genuine science? That's how can we distinguish genuine science from pseudoscience? What is the nature of the scientific method and of hypothesis testing? And we'll be dealing with that in a couple of weeks. What's the ontological status of theoretical entities? That is, do non-observable entities exist? What is the nature of scientific explanations, scientific laws, and scientific theories? Again, calling something a scientific theory doesn't make it a scientific theory. Calling something a science doesn't make it a science. How should we choose one theory or hypothesis over another? I mean, do we weigh them and then the thicker of the two is the one that we ought to accept? Well, that's a crappy reason. It's a reason we could give, but it'd be a bad one. How do we know, or do we know that the world is as we observe it? We're ending the semester by taking a couple of weeks spending on Kuhn's scientific revolutions and paradigm shifts. So is what Kuhn says about paradigms and scientific revolutions reasonable? That's an open question. In any event, these aren't the only fundamental questions we'll be exploring, and I hopefully have given you a sense of not just the specific fundamental questions we're going to be considering, but the important role fundamental questions play in doing philosophy. So, my question for you is, do you have any questions for me?